Hi, and welcome to the Elephant Room, where we talk about topics maybe in a little bit different manner than they're normally spoken about. We try and get a little bit deeper, a little bit broader, maybe a little bit more transparent about them, but we try and pick some interesting things that all of us encounter at some point or place in our career. And today we're going to talk about CEO transitions. So most of us have had a CEO transition. We've had one of our CEOs leave, whether it was a planned or unplanned departure. We've been part of the succession planning process, part of the executive search process that recruits the new chief executive. Or we may experience it in the future, but few things impact the enterprise like a chief executive transition. It can rock markets, it can affect stock prices, it can affect culture, it can affect the chemistry of the team, right? So, it's not a trivial subject by any means. So, with that, Jaco, you've got a lot of experience in CEO transitions. Why don't you start us off?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I think that a CEO transition is always critical and sometimes mission critical. And the real reason is, in my view, that the CEO is kind of the spider in the web of the organization. He's the conductor of the orchestra. And from that position, the CEO has lots of relations with investors. For instance, you just mentioned that. Be it the stock at the stock exchange or at PE companies or venture capitalists. He has relations with the supervisory board, with clients, with suppliers, business partners. It's always important to be very careful and think about the process of your CEO transitioning. I see. In our line of business, I see some natural transitions. That would be when a CEO finds a new job, the CEO retires, the CEO comes to the end of a fixed term, which is something we can talk about later, maybe, or maybe even just completed the assignment that he came on board for. Some CEOs come on board to revive a company, or to facilitate a turnaround or a ramp-up scenario. And then I see a lot of transitions, let's call them forced transitions or redundancies, and I think you can also talk a lot about this, but where a CEO would transition out because he or she underperforms, when there's a divergence between the strategy of the CEO and that of the way the board or the supervisory board looks at it. We recently had a CEO that had a burnout and took some time out. Luckily, he came back and is doing really well. There's some personal conflict, so there's a lot of various reasons that would invoke a CEO transition.
So let's use that last comment as a segue to explore a topic. So an unplanned transition versus a planned transition, or maybe when is it time to transition the CEO? So when do you think about transitioning a CEO? Any thoughts on that?
Is that a general question, Mike, or a
open-ended question?
When do you think about transitioning? I don't know, because for me, this is an interesting topic, because it's not something that I've personally experienced. So I've seen it almost from the outside looking in. Mm-hmm. And if I go by media, oftentimes when you hear of a CEO transition, it's because it didn't go very well.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing like when it happens well, it goes smooth to the point that you don't even notice it took place. And is that what you're looking to attain? Is that the goal? Or do you want to cause some rift in the process of transitioning? Is that part of the strategy?
Yeah, I think those are good questions, Roo. I think, from my perspective, you start planning CEO transitions day one. And not down to the micro granular level with a time frame, but with scenario modeling and planning, right? What happens if? What happens when? And so you may have CEOs that struggle operationally. They don't perform. You may have CEOs that, I guess commit malfeasance, misfeasance, fraud, gross negligence, so they may step on the wrong side of an irrecoverable issue. You may have CEOs that have something happen in their personal lives. I mean, market dynamics can just sway the trajectory of a company where a CEO's skill sets don't transition well to the new market dynamics, right? So there are all kinds of things that can cause an unplanned transition versus that smooth planned transition. So if you don't start modeling those different scenarios on day one, you can find yourself caught very flat-footed. So as an example, I've been brought into numerous situations where I get a call and I say, hey, XYZ has happened and we have to find a new CEO like yesterday. That's tough, right? That's tough for everybody. And it sends shockwaves throughout the enterprise, throughout the ecosystem, sometimes throughout the market. So if you don't do those models and that planning early on, you subject yourself to that potential risk. Jaco, what have you seen in terms of unplanned transitions that have surprised you in the market?
Well, let me rephrase that question a little bit. I think that what I like a lot is that companies, especially large companies, do a lot of succession planning. And they tend to spend a lot of time and energy on it, and they tend to do it really well. Yeah. If you would think, for instance, companies like Shell, for instance, Unilever. So a good succession planning is really, it's I would say, a framework for your executive development within your company. And it really aligns the function of the CEO with the strategy of the company. And it acts as a guideline for the CEO to adjust to internal and external change. So if you have a good succession planning framework, and that it really encompasses a good role description that's up to date, which can change because the external environment changes. It also describes the process of selection. If you're going to do it, how is your internal selection process going to look like, be it a redundancy or replacement? It describes the transition of the CEO, and you should really align that. I think every 2 years you should revisit it, align it with the strategy of your company, and that's where you just described the various scenarios comes in, because you have to have a couple of scenarios in place in case the market changes, in case there's an M&A, a new M&A strategy, and it all really feeds into the certain capabilities you need for a CEO, because obviously not one person has all the capabilities within him or herself, and that's really being used to benchmark your internal pipeline. So what I've seen is where there's a good succession planning in place, it feeds down into the organization, into the LDP or the leadership development plan. And if you do it well, there's always a couple of executives inside the company that's aligned and ready to fulfill the role of the next CEO, depending on the specific criteria that would be needed. That's why companies also spend a lot of time and energy sending these executives out to get some geographical experience or even get experience in different disciplines. And if they get it wrong, or if there's too big a gap between the executives internally, the executive pool, that's where they kind of infuse new talent within from outside into the organization, either by attracting them themselves or by hiring an executive search or recruitment company to do that for them.
Yeah, so let's thread that needle a little bit, right? Because you touched on a couple of things that I think are really interesting. So there's internal versus external candidates, right? And I apologize to everybody for my voice this morning. It's cracking everywhere, so hopefully it's not too annoying. But if you look at the internal versus external argument, most succession processes are built on kind of an old school 9-box framework, right? You identify your high potential talent, and you identify those that are ready now, ready near term, ready midterm, ready long term, that kind of thing. And the problem with that whole methodology is you don't know when the day is going to come, right? Because
Exactly.
let's say that you deem that they're ready now, but maybe something changes in the market, and 2 months from now, the ready now are no longer ready now. There's so many things that can influence that static matrix that I think it needs to be much, much more nuanced. And so, it's interesting how companies even approach this. So I look at every member of a C-level team should be a succession candidate in my mind. I mean, if they're not, why are they on your C-level team? I mean, if that is your executive team and any of those people can't step in, now they may all do the job differently. They may bring something different to the table, but they should be willing and able and prepared to do the job. And so it's interesting. We have some clients that think they've failed if they don't have an internal candidate. And they don't even want to consider external candidates. We have other clients that prefer external, right? They like the shiny new object, the illusion of what they don't know. We have some candidates that won't even consider somebody for succession unless they've been a sitting CEO, where we have other clients that want to take somebody that hasn't been in the chair, groom them to be in the chair, and give them a crack at the chair, right? So there's so many different philosophies in that regard. I don't know, Shaina, you've been pretty quiet. Thoughts on this?
Just listening and absorbing, because in the military, CEO succession was basically planned every 2 years, depending on the base and the position. But everything you're saying about like having someone either internal or external, it's making sense to me in terms of like the priorities of that company. So like if they're wanting to be injecting their company with new ideas or new experiences, that makes sense to go external. But if they want someone who's like going to continue along the path that they've been on and understands the nuances of their business, and internal makes sense to me.
There was in the past, actually before the banking crisis, it was big business. If you look at LDP programs, there was companies that made a lot of money by taking these executives out into the field, running them through all kinds of programs, taking them to the desert, put them through some strain, get them together to talk. So I have a friend who is an HR director, and he actually has a different view. He doesn't believe in succession planning, but he does believe in a very open and transparent leadership culture, and a lot of communication with the various leaders in his company, and actually has a relationship with a few search firms who has free access to the leaders in that company, and also to the outside market. So whenever there is a leadership position, it's very easy to talk to the or let's say to get access to an external pool, because these search firms knows the internal mechanics of the company.
That's interesting as well. I mean, you guys know this, maybe people watching don't, but I lead probably anywhere from a half a dozen to as many as 12 to 15 succession engagements every year, CEO succession assignments. And I think what makes my approach different in the market than many is it's not a one size fits all approach, right? I mean, I think there are a lot of people that are in the succession business that come to the table with a plan. Here's the right way, here's the wrong way, follow the dotted lines, follow the yellow brick road, all will end well. I will tell you, I've stepped into triage many of those engagements because you're spot on, Jaco. the internal mechanics of the company, the culture, the team dynamics, the values and the vision, the philosophical positions, the organizational alignment and construct, all of those things matter, right? Board perspective, capital markets perspective, public policy perspective. So if you just, I mean, if you just go, okay, here are 2 internal candidates and let's go find a couple of external candidates and let's compete them, there is no certitude whatsoever that the right CEO is in that small group, right? I mean, if you don't do all the rigor around figuring out the right CEO for that next chapter, you're just as likely to miss as you are not. So, you know, it's a really interesting process that I enjoy because, you know, there's some commonalities that go from assignment to assignment, but they're almost all really unique, as they should be, because, you know, plans don't succeed people, people succeed people. So if all you do is plan, you're gonna miss the boat, but you've got to do a decent amount of planning to uncover the right human being for the right reasons. Make sense?
So Mike, if I would be the HR director of a large multinational and I would consult with you on my succession planning, what would you advise me if I say, if we look at the sitting CEO has maybe a term of 2 years left, slowly but surely the supervisory board members are getting a bit jittery because they know that the time will come for them to set up a new nomination committee and start the internal search and benchmarking and maybe go out into the market to benchmark the current leadership pool they have. How would you approach that?
You know, I guess, first of all, you can never start too early. I think a lot of boards, a lot of HR directors, a lot of CHROs think, hey, I've got a year, that's plenty of runway. Hey, I've got 2 years or 3 years, that's plenty of runway. It's never enough runway because you really don't know what's going to happen on that journey, right? Maybe that 3-year runway contracts to 18 months for a certain reason or set of reasons. Maybe it extends for a certain set of reasons. So you have to start today. But mostly, I think what people, I think, are weary of is they want an easy solution, not the right solution. They want kind of a plug and play solution. And that, you know, I tend to drive boards a little bit nutty in the early days of an assignment because I like to disappear into the bowels of an organization, right? I want to know everything I can about that organization at different levels and different geographies through different lenses, so that as I begin to kind of collaborate with the nominating committee, the selection committee, with the outgoing CEO, with HR, you know, we have some shared understanding and we've got some common ground and we can test different assumptions and different theses, right? But if you don't take the time to go do that, you miss. Yeah, Roo, did you have something?
How do you do that, Mike? Because this is interesting, because this is like out of any area of my expertise. So now I have a bunch of questions and curiosity. Yeah. And that is, especially in this day and age where your clientele has more visibility than ever before, your employees have more visibility than any before, and now they literally have the ability to inject themselves into conversation through something as simple as a tweet. How do you prep someone to transition and prepare them for the heat? And like, this takes me to one of my earliest experience in my work life. Like about 10 years ago, I happened to be at Apple, and right around the midst of 2010, Steve Jobs' transition was ready to hand over the seat to Tim Cook. And I can tell you, for me, it was very, very odd as a young person seeing how everybody, not only in the company, but our clients on a daily basis telling us, oop, this is the end of Apple, is about to burst into flames. So like, how do you prep someone to take that level of heat in this day and age? And I'm like, and this is in 2010. And now it's even gotten worse, I think, in many regards, as what you may face coming into this type of position.
You know, it's a great question. So it touches on a couple of things. Number one, how confidential is the succession plan going to be or not? How transparent is it going to be or not? And that's not necessarily a right or wrong issue. It's kind of a cultural issue within, an organizational framework. So some companies are very transparent and everybody knows what's going on. The comms plan assumes that from day one, and there's lots of messaging to get out in front of things. I think the thing that you bring up that's really interesting is for companies that don't necessarily want to signal to the market certain things,
Yes.
and they're worried about information leaking out there. Well, in a publicly traded company, there are, SEC regulations that say, if an announcement is made, it has to be made. You can't be talking about it, doing all these things and not make an announcement, right? So there's some guidelines in place that shape some of those conversations. But where it's just internal planning, absent announcement, and doesn't fall under certain regulatory rules, the guidance to the client is, look, it's not if, but when it's going to leak. The message is definitely going to get out there. So what you have to do is identify the key stakeholders and constituencies, make sure that the comms plan addresses that. And if you can get out in front of that wave, so those key stakeholders can influence that messaging, that helps. If you have to react to it, still very, very doable. But I got to tell you, everybody has an opinion about a CEO, right? There were people, to your point, Roo, that thought Steve Jobs leaving Apple was going to be the end of it. Well, if you look at Tim Cook's track record, it's nothing short of absolutely phenomenal what he's done at Apple. Now, you may agree with certain things or disagree with certain things, but if you're just looking at financial metrics, not too shabby, right? So I think sometimes we can get hung up on a certain leadership identity. Very big shoes to fill. Yeah, maybe not. That's the wrong way to look at it, right? You hope that the next, the incoming CEO creates a bigger presence and has a larger impact and brings more to the table than the person leaving. And the person leaving should want that to help solidify, that portion of their legacy as they exit. So, but the messaging is key. We spend a lot of time on communications plans. I mean, that's probably a good 20-25% of a succession assignment is really making sure that you've identified every constituency, every stakeholder, who the influences are, who the evangelists are going to be, who the agitators are going to be. And you have to touch all those people, right? You have to get the board aligned with a message, the executive team down a few layers. And it can be like managing a 3-ring circus, but done well. Circuses are entertaining. Done well, they're kind of scary. So, it's a project. It's definitely a project.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that once the market gets notion of a new CEO, in the background, there's been a program running for a long, long time. These searches sometimes takes a year or even longer. I prefer searches where it's all in the open and where you can go to the market in all transparency and help to facilitate the best candidate for the specific company, the phase where that company is in its maturity, or the specific strategy that they are deploying at that moment. But the searches engulfed in secrecy, those are usually the tough ones. But and I have a question for you, Mike, in terms of terms. Do you believe in any limitations that there should be a time limitation on a CEO term, or I'd like to get your view on that?
I can make an argument for or against it. My personal belief is I don't believe in it because I don't think you should time bound success, right? You don't want to take somebody that's successful and yank them out of the chair. Neither do you want to have somebody that is, they're starting to decline in their ability to perform and leave them in the chair. Yeah. So I don't think a CEO can be too young. I don't think they can be too old. I don't have a preconception of what a CEO looks like. What I'm looking for is what they bring to the role, how they're going to impact the company, how they're going to carry it forward. So, I've seen CEOs that are 70 years old that have enough energy to make a cup of coffee nervous, right? I mean, they go 100 miles an hour. Their intellectual acuity is high. They're engaged, they're creative, they're intellectually curious. And then I've seen CEOs that are 35 years old that, I could lap them and they're not self-aware enough to know that they're even being lapped. So age isn't a function. Really, it's about talent and engagement and perspective and curiosity and just really having a heart for the people you lead. And that can happen, at any stage of career life cycle. But I don't know. Those are my thoughts. I mean, Roo, Shaina, what do you guys think?
I don't know. I think there's no longer a mold, but I would make that argument for any position, not only the CEO. And I think if you start searching for someone to fit in a specific mold, especially in this day and age, you just only doing yourself a disservice. You're not starting from zero, but you're like going to like negative 100 before you start running. Like if I can put it in that way. So like for me, that's exciting looking into the future of business. The fact that molds are being broken every single day. But I think what I like to see and I continue to see more of is like people being more authentic as leaders and like truly being themselves. And I think if more and more companies embrace that, I think it only creates a huge level of excitement going forward, from my perspective.
Yeah. The best organization. Go ahead, Shaina.
I was just going to answer Jaco's question about term limits. Like, I don't think that you should just slap a time limit on it in terms of, like Mike was saying, success or not success, because sometimes people don't have the time to see their projects come to fruition or whatever they were trying to do. And so I just don't think that necessarily fits what a business needs from their leadership.
I like what you say, and I asked this question specifically because I also don't believe in a time limit. I think it's more, for me, it's competency based, and if the CEO fits in a specific time frame with a specific task at hand, in a specific moment in the maturity curve of that company, it doesn't matter how long that CEO or that board member sits in that role. What you do see is, if you look at supervisory board members, that they usually time limited, and it's really because you want to keep them sharp. You want to make sure that they don't get too intimate with certain stakeholders. So they usually transition out. They have a 4-year term. They might have another 4-year term, and then it's the end, and then it's time for a new, fresh, independent board members. I'm not talking about the management board, but the supervisory board, a new board member to transition in. So that's just a little bit different, but I kind of agree with all three of you.
So it'll be interesting to get your take on this, Jaco. You mentioned the word competency. As we look at CEOs and leaders in this decade, what would you say are 3 competencies that from your experience is a must on every CEO?
That's a fantastic question. And I think that Mike can also have a lot to add. But at the possibly on the first place, I would say authenticity. That's the one thing that kind of comes back to bite every leader, be it the CEO, be it the CFO, the HR director. If you're not authentic, because that's your makeup, that is who you are. And at the end, when you're under pressure, the real executive will come out, and so it's important to have that out there in front. I would say the second thing would be a good understanding of yourself. If you're attuned with yourself as a leader, it is much easier to interact with others, because you usually use yourself as a soundboard. And I would say the third one would be a healthy understanding of interpersonal relationships. Because that's one thing that the leader does is continuously, we're not machines, continuously in interactions with other people within the company and with various other stakeholders.
Can I?
Mike?
I was gonna ask Jaco and everybody on the call to expand on authenticity, just because, like Jackie said, authentic is word of the day for leaders, which turns it. I'm afraid of it turning into a buzzword. And I'm afraid of people taking authenticity and making it like something they can pretend to be, basically. Yeah. So like, how do you actually show up at work in an authentic way? And then for people who are like wanting to maintain that like barrier between work and personal, how do you show up authentically as a leader and maintain that?
Yeah, I'm starting to like this conversation because it in a sense it gets it's a tough conversation because you're kind of talking about personality traits, and when I evaluate candidates, I always use myself as a tool, and I let it work with me and resonate with me what I like, and I find this a good indicator of authenticity is when you, as a leader, when you're able to come up with war stories. It's not always the look at what I did and how great and how successful I am, but we talked about it I think last week too, showing your belly, showing your other side, showing the part of me that still needs to be developed. If you're big enough to be able to acknowledge your own shortcomings and where you need to develop yourself further as a leader, for me, you get very close to being authentic, because then you're in tune with yourself.
I agree with that, Jaco. And I think, Shaina, one of the things I like about the word authentic is that I don't think you can fake it. As compared to other words or other buzzwords out there, because authenticity is going to look different from person to person. So if somebody tries to act, I don't know, like if I try to act like Mike, it's not going to look genuine. And the same thing if we were to just shift roles. Like, authenticity is going to be different from person to person, and I think it's being comfortable with yourself and allowing people to see yourself in a work environment, which I think is in many ways, it's probably a new concept. I know when I first got into the workforce, you put up a front of what you think is the ideal kind of perception I want people to have of me. Yeah, exactly. And I think now some of those barriers are being broken, and for me, it's exciting that this is being embraced more and more every day. And maybe in part of it comes from society and what's happening out there, but also in work environments.
Well, we talk about roles, and when you talk about the role, it's also like becoming the role. So when you should have the discussion actually with CEOs or even other board members the first time that they become that role, the first role as a CEO or the first role as the CFO. And that's where authenticity comes in. Am I starting to act the role, or do I function in that role being myself as a person? Do I give color to the role, or do the role give color to me? And I would prefer giving color to the role. So again, the authenticity discussion, which is it's a difficult discussion, but just trying to convey a little bit of how I would look at it.
Hey, I want to come back to this topic, but we just had a question from Stan Thompson about the average tenure of CEOs. And over the last couple of decades, it's kind of bounced around between 3.7 years and about 4.6 years. Right now, it's hovering in the low fours, like 4.1, 4.2. Now, those are metrics based on large multinational companies, right? If you take it down and incorporate stage of life cycle, you have some founder entrepreneurs that hold the CEO chair for many, many years. But in large organizations, they'll generally cycle, right now around, 4.5 years. There are obviously exceptions to that rule, but that's about the average. But coming back to what you guys were talking about with respect to authenticity, I think that's everything. And as a leader, a real leader, an authentic leader, you have to learn to be uncomfortable. You have to be comfortable with you. You guys nailed it, because I'll tell you, it took me a long time to get there, and I'm still in that uncomfortable zone, and I'm still trying to be more authentic, because it didn't come easy for me, because I grew up in that generation where it's about how you looked and what you said and how you dressed and the presence that you brought into the room and
Playing the role.
How crisp and articulate you were. And you guys will notice in recent times, even the tenor of how I hold a conversation has changed, because I'm not just speaking in little sound bites anymore. I'm actually engaging, and I may even ramble a little bit from time to time now, but it's intentional because I'm trying to test things and understand more broadly, and communicate more authentically. And I got to tell you, it hasn't been an easy transition for me. I find myself, I always was very comfortable because I knew what my script was. I knew the role that I was playing. But as the market has shifted, it just doesn't work. So CEOs today have to change the way they engage. And it starts with being comfortable. And you can see it in the market right now with what's going on real time around us, right? Turn on the news. I don't care whether you're a CNN, a Fox, an MSNBC, doesn't matter. Turn it on and watch the CEOs that come on and react to what's going on in the world today. Some are obviously very comfortable with being uncomfortable. They're very comfortable with who they are, and they're okay with the convictions that they're going to express. Others, it's just dead opposite, right? It's a soundbite. It's a talking point. You can sense that it's not intellectually honest, maybe completely disingenuous, but you can see it, you can feel it, right? I mean, what do you guys think?
I think the best leaders that I've heard speak would usually be able to do it just off the cuff, because they were speaking from experience, they were speaking from what they actually believed. And I'm not knocking on people who need a script when they go to a speaking engagement, because that's a very that's a nerve-wracking experience. But I think that leaders who are being authentic and speaking from where their values are, generally to me come off more authentic. And so I think that for anyone who's wanting to be a more authentic leader, you have to go through that exercise of really figuring out what your values are, and are they actually aligned with your organization? Because I think it's really easy to step into a role and try to fit yourself into that versus find the right fit for you.
So I have a question, and this is just kind of along the lines of my generation, and we don't tend to commit for a very long period of time to any company, and many studies have proved this. Do we?
Are you telling us something, Roo?
No, well, I think I'm one of the exceptions. I need to be places for a long time, but I know that most of my friends, they be in a place for 2 years and they're like, "Oh, that's it. I'm looking for something new." Do we see this translating to executive level roles and potentially someone at the helm of a company over the next decade, as more and more millennials find themselves in those seats? Will these type of transition discussions be taking place every other year now? I don't know.
Yeah, well, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think, first of all, millennials are aging as well, right? And I think they're gathering more experience. I think as they test different things, they're getting a better idea of what it is that they're looking for, right? Because they just have more experience to frame that concept. But mostly at the C level, if you shorten turnover to a year or two, you essentially have a rudderless organization, right? You can't envision something and drive it and see it through. It'll be so herky jerky that it just won't work, right? So at the senior levels, you tend to see more stability, and it's for a reason. You have a strategic portfolio of initiatives that you're trying to execute, and not all of those can be done in 6 months or a year or 18 months. You're trying to take an organization from here to there, and that journey may not happen in a year or 18 months. So I think, people earlier in their career life cycle move more often, right? When I was starting out, I moved quite often, right? My stability on my resume is probably no more different in the early stages of my career life cycle than most millennials, because I was gathering experience. I was looking for new things. I was trying to see, where I fit and how I could shape things. And so, younger generations are going through that as well. But I think at some point in time, I think you're going to, Roo, I hate to break it to you, you've been here more than 2 years.
That I have. The reason I brought that up is because to me, when you said the averages of it being 4.2 years, and it's funny, I think Stan just responded something very, very similarly. It sounds like a very short period of time.
Yeah.
Like in my mind, I'm like, can you really have an amazing impact on any organization in 3 to 4 years? And like, to me, it's just, it just doesn't compute, doesn't connect in my brain. I don't know why my thoughts was like, oh, most CEOs, they probably sit in a role for 8 to 10 years on average.
Well, I think it did change. It did change. In a couple of years ago, maybe a decade ago, 15 years ago, if a board member or let's say just an executive, if they switched too often, it wasn't a good sign. They wanted people to. It was actually. You were looked upon as a good CEO if you stayed in the seat. And these days, I think the tendency is that when I talk to boards, they like it when an executive has seen a bit of the world, has traveled a bit, seen different companies, different cultures. So it's even more positive. It's being viewed more positive these days on a curriculum vitae if an executive has traveled a bit and gained some experience.
Yeah, the other thing too is I think it's a fair statement, at least in my observations, that the markets are moving faster than any single person's ability to learn, right? I mean, things are evolving faster around us than we are acclimating to the evolving environments. And that impacts executives too. So, you come into an organization as a new CEO, and your job is to understand what you just stepped into, right? You need to go on a learning journey. You need to understand your people and your culture and your team and your value chain, your supply chain. You need to really understand who and what it is that you're about to lead. And you have to have a very good line of sight for as far as you can realistically have it, which is shortened over time as well, right? I mean, we all grew up during the days where you did 10, 15, 20-year business plans. Sure. Don't do that anymore, right? Because anything that you're trying to forecast 10 years from now, forget about it. You're wrong. Nobody has that level. I mean, my crystal ball cracked long ago. I got out of the prognostication business long ago because the markets move too quickly. And so what you can do is put the best leader that you can, the best CEO that you can in the chair for that season, and do everything you can to resource that CEO and do everything. And that CEO should do everything that he or she can do to resource the broader team. And you go on that journey for as long as it makes sense. But when the wheels start to come off, that's when it gets real interesting. Are they having a slump? Will they work their way through the problems? How much time do you give them to work their way through the problems? Will they be able to work themselves through the problems. And that's where, the board has to step in, and they have to have some pretty good perspective of how much leash are we going to extend here? How much rope are we going to give here? And that varies company to company.
Just to play back that movie a little bit, Mike, I think one of the important things for being successful is the first couple of months of a CEO being in the seat. And that transition period is something that companies need to think about more carefully. It's extremely important that once it's known, that the new board member or the CEO is stepping in, that there is a period where there's some good knowledge transfer between the outgoing CEO and the incoming CEO. And it also means that the outgoing CEO uses the time to introduce the new CEO to the various stakeholders. So it's not only about making the 6-month plan or the 9-month plan. I think it's very good to have that, because then at least you have something structured built into it. And the last thing where I see a lot of benefit in is making sure, I would call it the building a bit of the backbone, and it's the backbone with the chairman. Is when the CEO has good backing and understanding, and they've built that relationship from the beginning on, and the outgoing CEO, if it's been let's say a natural transition out, can help a lot in that process, making sure that there's a strong, solid relationship within the first 6 months. Because usually, if it wobbles there, and from there on, it kind of the CEO gets into a nice rhythm.
Well, there's so many different dynamics. I don't disagree with anything you've said, Jaco. However, there are instances where the outgoing CEO becomes the executive chairman and then transitions into the non-executive chairman and then transitions out, right? So there are multiple transitions, and how does the incoming CEO feel like he or she has the ability to do what they need to do when they've got the outgoing CEO sitting on the board, and that outgoing CEO is probably still more thinking like a CEO than an executive chairman, because that role is new to he or she as well, right? Yeah. So there are all these little moving pieces, and that's why most of my engagements kind of map a 2 or 3 year period from the point in time the announcement's made, right? Because the success in succession doesn't occur on the baton pass. It occurs at some time period certain out in the future where people can look back and say, we've had a win. It's not on day one, right? So you have to map that entire thing, and then you have to map it in such a way that agility is built into it, because that map that you just created is not going to be the map that ends up lasting that whatever that journey is, right? It's going to change 3, 4, 5, 6 times. But that's what makes the whole process interesting, is just having enough experience to know how to navigate all these speed bumps, because there's a ton of them, right? A ton of them.
I just see a nice confession here from Jacqueline. She says that she regrets not moving around in her earlier career. And it's something I can resonate, but on the other end, it's never too late to move around a bit. I see these days people keep on working. There's no such a thing as retiring at 65 or 60 anymore. Times have changed. So Jacqueline, I would say no regrets, but make your move.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting insight, right? I mean, we deal with it all the time in search engagements when we're discussing candidates with a client, and we see lots of moves on a resume, right? There are a certain class of human resources people out there that will almost out of hand summarily dismiss somebody when they see hoppiness or jumpiness or lots of moves, right? It just resonates poorly to them. Now, in my opinion, those are not good critical thinkers. Those are not deep thinkers. I don't care about the moves. I care about why the moves were made, how the transitions took place. Were they good faith? Were they bad faith? Were people on all sides being good actors? And was it transparent? Did they get recruited away for a bigger opportunity, something that they couldn't pass by? Had they accomplished the mission where they were? It's not about the dates on the resume. It's about what underpins those dates, and kind of forward-thinking selection and nominating committees, forward-thinking talent acquisition people, forward-thinking chief human resources officers. They get that. You don't have to educate them on that. But there are a lot of people out there that can't get past that. They get stuck with that because 20 years ago, somebody told them that that's a sign of instability, right? Well, I guess, it's not 20 years ago, right? It's 2020.
Where I do see it make a big difference is, for instance, if you talk about interim executives. An interim executive, it's people, they come in for a big, it's usually a big transition, a moment of change, for 6 months, 1 year, help the transition, and then they're gone again. There you usually want to have an executive who has traveled a bit, seen a bit of the world, worked at a lot of companies, managed many different projects or programs. So then it's good that you have a kind of a CV or a background where you've done many different things through the years. Yeah. The hiring party like to see that. And it's a bit about managing expectations. Is it somebody that's going to stay or go, leave very early? When you talk about fixed jobs, people like to see a bit of stability. Where interims have more, you could look at it as more unstable curriculums, which is not really what it is. It's inherent in the business. In fixed jobs, especially HR directors like to see some stability in the background build-up of an executive's curriculum.
Yeah, this raises another thing too. So we're right in the middle of, what do we want to call it? Economic instability, political instability, just general market instability, right? There's a lot of questions about where things are going to move. And there's a generally held opinion, a rule of thumb, right? It's Kentucky windage, but you will hear it all the time. Never change chief executives in the middle of a crisis. And, I think you can make an argument for that, right? I can opine in the affirmative there. I can also make a dissenting argument. And again, I think, so much of talent and HR and executive search is built on a legacy mindset based on rules of thumb, that were experiences that are held as universal truths that really aren't, right? So, sometimes the absolute right thing to do is change chief executives in the middle of a crisis because there's good reason to. Sometimes no. Sometimes, maybe early in the crisis, late in the crisis, the midpoint in the crisis, as you're going in, as you're coming out, but it's specific to the leader, that organization, and how the dynamics and atmospherics are impacting that organization. But to have people say, oh, nope, we can't make a change. We're getting killed, but we can't make a change. Everything's going where, but we can't make a change. That's where rules of thumb they'll make your thumbs bleed is what they'll do. They just don't work, right?
I guess it's about a calculated risk too of the board or the supervisory board. It's not that it can be very complicated. If you get it right, you are the hero. If you get it wrong, you can induce extra pain into the organization if you make a switch in a time of crisis. But as my wife used to say, never waste a good crisis either. So if you had plans of changing the CEO, it's a good moment to do that.
You brought up, I think, a great point, Jaco. And for me, I think it's getting stakeholders, be it the board, the nominating committee, other people involved in the process, to understand the difference between real risk and theoretical risk. and then be able to weight those, identify those, weight those, and take the different levels of risk and stack rank them in order of your ability to live with those risks, right? So, it's the classic, hey, here's a CEO that's had a great track record and a great run at company X, and here's an internal candidate that we're really high on, but they've never been a CEO.
Who still needs to prove him or herself.
Yeah. But there's real risk with the external candidate, because just because he or she had success with company A doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have success at this enterprise.
Yeah.
And it doesn't
necessarily. The perception is from the board's perspective that it's low risk versus the internal candidate who has never proved him or herself on that level yet.
Yep. Yeah. It's a discussion that I have, a deep, long discussion that I have with clients, right? So, I mean, I can, just as an example, when we're going in to talk about being engaged for succession, right? I don't go in with a slide deck, because I'm not looking to make a presentation. I'm looking to have a dialogue, right? I don't want to do a monologue. I want to have a conversation, and I want to ask questions and learn, and I want to explore, and I want to see, how well formed the client's opinions are, how concerned they are about the optics versus getting it actually right, because I may not be interested in the assignment because maybe set up to fail, right? So I take these things really seriously, and I'm looking to kind of lead people to the right place, which is, it doesn't matter whether it's an internal candidate, an external candidate, somebody that's sat in the chair, somebody that's never sat in the chair, somebody younger, older, none inside of industry, outside of industry. None of that really matters if you get the right leader, right? Because we've seen dark horse candidates that, based on their resume alone, probably would be dismissed out of hand on day one because they weren't on spec. But lo and behold, that dark horse candidate ends up being the last candidate standing because they're genius in a certain area, or they unlock value in a new and different way, or they bring something else to the table, but on paper, no. But see, most search firms and most selection and nominating committees wouldn't even give somebody like that a shot. But in about 20% of instances, we find that those candidates are the last candidate standing. So in 20% of instances, companies are making the wrong decision based on bias, right?
Agree.
It's crazy. Well, we are at 11:58. As you guys can probably tell, I could talk about this for days on end. I love this. My voice is starting to come back. I hate to hit the end button, but this might be a good place to leave it. Maybe we just revisit it in greater depth at a point later on. So, Roo, you want to wind us up, sir?
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining today. And if you haven't, please subscribe in any of the mediums that you happen to be watching. And if you got any nuggets of info, please feel free to share. And we'll catch you again next Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern.
All right. Thanks, everybody. See you soon.